Chinese people are embracing Bitcoin for practical solutions for problems that they have that their government has caused for them. I think the critical question of the 21st century is going to be, can you bring economic prosperity, energy prosperity to people without there needing to be a coordinating entity, without there needing to be guns and armies? And I think Bitcoin is a large part of that.
Hey everyone, quick thing before we start. Over 50,000 of you keep coming back to watch and listen to this podcast, but over 65% of you still haven't subscribed yet. So here's my simple ask. If you find value in my Bitcoin content and you enjoy what I'm doing, please take a second to hit subscribe on YouTube or follow me on your go-to podcasting app. It's a small action that really helps push my content through the algorithm, and this way we can make sure that more people learn about Bitcoin. Thanks for being part of this journey. Now let's dive into this episode. All right, Roger Huang, welcome to Bitcoin for Millennials.
Brent, thanks for having me on Bitcoin for Millennials. Been watching a few of the episodes. I think you're killing the game of getting Bitcoin content out there. So glad to be on here.
Awesome, man. I appreciate that. Well, thanks so much for coming on. I think you have written a fascinating book, Would Mao Hold Bitcoin? And I think it's interesting to dive into Bitcoin, China, macro, politics. So I think we'll have a fun chat. I was thinking to start with, obviously we are at this start of this bull run and people are throwing prices around, etc. And some people say, last time we were already on our way to 100K, but then the China mining ban came along and that messed everything up and people got scared, etc., etc. So yeah, I kind of wanted to start with that subject. So how do you view, China's role in banning, Bitcoin mining, banning it as, making it illegal to hold cryptocurrencies and Bitcoin, and that was in 2021. How do you think that affected, Bitcoin's development and the global perception in a sense?
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting. I'm kind of, as we're recording this, I was in El Salvador right before, and we were hitting all-time highs pretty much every day. So definitely a very euphoric time to be talking about all this. I think 2021 was interesting. So China's really, really confusing, I think, for a lot of people, and especially what they did with Bitcoin. So I always have to explain, for example, that it's not actually illegal to hold Bitcoin in China, but it is illegal to, there is a criminal kind of statute for trying to buy virtual currencies, and that includes Tether as well. Exchanges aren't allowed, and mining certainly isn't allowed in many of the provinces. And so, overall, you can say that China basically tried to kill or tried to restrict the network, definitely with the actions that it took. So China had a very negative role, at least the Chinese government. One thing I always tell people is you have to separate the Chinese people from the Chinese government. I know this sounds, very intuitive, but it's hard to see in practice. Mm-hmm. So when people talk about China, Bitcoin, they're always thinking about the government mostly. And it's mostly about, how many bans or unbans or stuff like that. But regardless of what the government does, we have a lot of data to show that Chinese people are actually buying more and more Bitcoin. So for example, on chain analysis, they have these relationships with, again, it's kind of a gray zone to buy Bitcoin. So we don't have a lot of quantitative metrics in China. We have a lot of qualitative, but the stuff that we do have quantitatively seems to show that since 2021, there's only been an uplift in the amount of Bitcoin that's being purchased by Chinese people. For example, chain analysis, I've posted this graph before, but you went from a few $1 billion in inflows to China-based OTC desks per quarter to now it's almost like triple, right? And this was in Q2 2024. And I think you're going to still see that continuing momentum. There's a lot of indications that there's a lot of activity in that regard. So that's kind of one thing to think about. But yeah, I think China's bans were definitely seen as a negative factor. But what I'm seeing this cycle, which is really interesting, is there's almost a positive FUD. I don't think China's going to do anything more in terms of bans or restrictions. That would surprise me a lot. But it would also surprise me if China actually reversed its policy stance and quote unquote unbanned, right? There have been quite a few senior officials of the Chinese Communist Party that are imprisoned for taking bribes in cryptocurrency or for running a Bitcoin mining company kind of on the side of their duties. So the famous case is Xiao Yi. So that's someone who was a Fuzhou party secretary, and then he was the provincial secretary or something or other, a quite senior official who is in life imprisonment for, encouraging the use of Bitcoin mining, and for himself, I think, colluding with Bitcoin miners during the time of the national ban or moratorium on mining. So, I always say like free Ross, but like if you don't see these people being freed, then I don't think the Chinese government's really changed its stance, right? Like in terms of the laws and things related to that. But it's interesting because you see a lot of positive headlines. And you're going to continue to see a lot of positive headlines because I think, the Chinese people, the economy is doing really badly in China right now. There's maybe some signs of recovery, but it seems like youth unemployment is quite high. It seems like, real estate and the domestic stock market are doing quite poorly. The Chinese government has been doing its version of monetary stimulus, right, in order to try to push a recovery, in China. And so that all creates positive headlines because Chinese people are looking to buy more and more Bitcoin. And B, just the global macro picture, China is now trying to be more expansionary in its money supply, right? So that's also bullish for Bitcoin. So you're going to see a lot of these headlines. You're also going to see like headlines that are more like qualitative. So even though I don't think that China is likely to reverse some of the restrictions it's placed, I don't think it's going to put on new ones. It would surprise me a lot as well. But you're going to see headlines like, for example, there was a vice minister of finance, a former one, not an actively serving one. So when Trump went to PubKey, was talking about crypto burgers or whatever, a few weeks after that, the former vice minister of finance was like, Trump talks about, they don't really think about Bitcoin specifically, but, Trump talks about crypto so often, maybe we made a mistake, right? So you'll see these kind of headlines, but I don't know that you're going to see substantive moves. But that might be enough for Bitcoin price level. For Bitcoin to smash past 100K, you probably just don't need the Chinese government to be doing anything actively. And it can't really, we can talk about this a little bit more, but it doesn't really have any more levers left. And you might just need it's almost like positive FUD. It's like these headlines that are like, China's this or China's that. For example, China allows Bitcoin as property. That's been the case for like years.
But now that's interesting. Yeah. I wanted to ask you about that because I saw a tweet about that. I think last week, but so that's never changed.
That hasn't really changed the legal system. So I wrote about it. Actually, there's an article in October 2023 where I was trying to clarify this because that was back when Justin Sun, Tron guy, said something really similar. He was like, look, the courts have validated Bitcoin as property and like, et cetera. That's pretty long-standing precedent. And different courts in the Chinese system will kind of analyze this issue every once in a while. Because what happens is you have a case, right? You have a case of someone who, I don't even remember what specifically triggered this case. I probably have to write or research that a little bit more. But typically it's someone has a contract with someone, they're trying to pay someone with Bitcoin. And then they either don't pay the Bitcoin or something else, or, someone seizes someone else's Bitcoin or whatever, some kind of dispute that arises. And then it goes into the court system in China, and sometimes different courts will bump into this issue. They usually lean on like the regulators. And so the way the courts have typically interpreted it in China is that Bitcoin is property that is protected. But if you use Bitcoin, this is where it gets a little bit confusing. But basically, if you had the Bitcoin from before, let's say you're like an OG, you had the Bitcoin from before, and that Bitcoin was stolen from you, that is property. And so, the courts will educate that and everything like that. But the problem is like, if you're using it, so like, for example, if you're trying to use Bitcoin as payment between two parties and you sign a contract that says, I owe you like 500 million yuan or whatever, but like, I'm going to pay you a Bitcoin, but then, the person doesn't pay. So then the other person goes to the courts. The courts may say something like, hey, you're not using Bitcoin as property. You're trying to use Bitcoin as currency. That's kind of illegal, right? So it's very subtle, but the point being that the courts have the Chinese court system is actually kind of interesting in the sense of I mean, obviously there's the larger implications of that. I don't pretend to be like a lawyer or like a cross-comparative lawyer, but like the few times I've written about it, the Chinese courts have often talked about protecting Bitcoin as property. So I say it's positive FUD because people bring it up that like there's another case, and you might not know, or your viewers might not know that that's been the case for a while, right? So it's kind of like, it serves as like a positive thing because then people read the tweet and they're like, oh, maybe Bitcoin will be unbanned in China, right? But that's always kind of been the case. If that makes sense.
Bitcoin custody is evolving, and while self-custody is important, it has its own risks and trade-offs. OnRamp is pioneering a new standard, multi-institution custody, which eliminates single points of failure, adding fault tolerance and redundancy to your custody setup. OnRamp secures your Bitcoin in a segregated cold storage multi-signature vault, guarded by 3 independent institutional-grade custodians, none of which have unilateral control. Your funds are fully auditable on-chain, cannot be rehypothecated, and can only move or withdrawn at your explicit direction. Multi-institution custody removes the technical, mental, and physical burdens of private key management, providing unparalleled peace of mind for you and your loved ones. Bitcoin is money, and as the price continues to appreciate, OnRamp helps you seamlessly tap into financial services like trading, inheritance, insurance, loans, IRAs, and more, all without compromising on security or accessibility. Check out onrampbitcoin.com through the link below and schedule a consultation with the OnRamp team to get to know them and learn more about their offering.
Do you think there is some sort of strategy also behind that to deem it as property and also to kind of like act on that in, the examples that you give? Or is it just, I don't want to say random, but by kind of just by accident, and that there's no real strategy behind that?
No, I think there is a strategy. I think two things that are not, and I've talked to a few people who are more politically connected than I am, let's just say, because like I don't pretend to know exactly what the party thinks at any given moment, but there are some people in the Chinese Bitcoin scene that I've seen share kind of similar views. The first thing is that the Chinese government doesn't, as surprising as it might be for Bitcoiners like us, doesn't necessarily think about Bitcoin that much. Like even the 2021 stuff, like that was kind of like the peak of it. So that was kind of not like random, but it was part of like a larger discussion. Like the whole Bitcoin mining thing that came up was kind of like they were having a meeting about a financial stability committee. Afterwards, Liu He, who's like the senior advisor of like US China trade relations and stuff like that, he was what we call he was basically Xi's like most senior economic advisor at the time. He's actually no longer in power. He's retired as of this term, but he still apparently has Xi Jinping's ear, right? He was kind of like the principal person who was signing, if you remember the Trump, Xi Jinping, like they had the trade war stuff and they had the trade agreements and phase agreements. So Liu He was sort of like China's representative for those agreements, right? So he said something, and he is the most senior member so far to comment directly on Bitcoin, but he's not necessarily that senior. Like he was in the Politburo, but he was not in the upper, what they call the Politburo Select Committee. And so the first thing is that like, I don't necessarily think China thinks about Bitcoin, or at least senior leadership, like whether or not Xi Jinping thinks about Bitcoin. I don't think they actually think about it like that largely. So, but they are pretty deliberate, and where it's deliberate is that the central bank, the People's Bank of China and financial regulators are very against Bitcoin. And so China has been on this tact of doing, essentially the world's most advanced central bank digital currency, the digital yuan, right? And trying to use that. And they've explicitly named Bitcoin, and Libra as reasons for why they started doing that research, right? Because they didn't want, Bitcoin to be kind of used in that way. And so when the courts talk about the currency thing, it's because of the fear of the central bank and the regulators, right? So it's deliberate in that way, but it's almost like it's the technocrats in the Chinese system that are kind of like deciding the conversation. Versus in the States, you see it's more like the politicians, right? So the Fed doesn't have a very strong opinion on central bank digital currencies, according to Powell, right? He basically has said that like they will defer to Congress. In China, it's kind of the reverse. In China, the technocrats have very specific concerns. So for example, the central banks, right? They're very concerned of currency displacement, and they're very concerned of people using Bitcoin to leave China's economic system, which has capital controls and restrictions to how you can use your money. And they're very concerned about corrupt officials, either receiving bribes or, taking money out of the country. But they're not, like, for example, Bitmain and all those different companies, all those miners that originally were in China, they're not so concerned that those funds remain, like, they're in Chinese hands, right? They haven't gone and tried to seize people's Bitcoin, right? In fact, the courts have kind of ruled the opposite. So I think it's kind of like the technocrats have very specific fears, and the leadership, the party leadership doesn't care enough almost to bring up an opinion, right? Now, if someone, and I've always said this, and David Bailey wrote something about how Xi Jinping is being orange pilled and stuff like that. That's way above my pay grade. If somebody convinces Xi Jinping to be orange pilled, then he can push all this mechanism aside in a matter of a couple of sentences. For example, the central bank has moved, based on one or two sentences of his. I just don't think that they actually think about it that much. But with Trump talking about Bitcoin so often, the Chinese leadership will be forced to at least acknowledge that this is an active issue. So they're going to be watching that, and I think it'll be interesting to kind of see. But I don't know if that helps clarify a little bit.
Oh, yes, definitely. Because I thought, I read that tweet. I didn't know this background of the difference between property and currency. I think that's a very good distinction. I also think it's very interesting. I would love to talk about that in a minute. This kind of tension between, what if America adopts this, but China is on a path to have even way more control in their own closed monetary system, right? How does that maybe threaten it or force them to actually have a look at Bitcoin? I think it's very interesting. Even more in the BRICS setting, I would say, whereas, I don't think they will get to a point where they will decide, okay, we're going to use the yuan to trade between India and South Africa. I don't think that's going to happen. So they have an issue there. So yeah, I'd love to talk about that in a minute, but I wanted to ask you about, so we had this come up in 2021. We are all hyped, everything goes up, etc. And then, you have this mining ban. What do you think about, kind of Bitcoin's resilience, also in China? As you mentioned, people are still buying, despite bans on trading and mining.
Yeah. Well, I wrote about it more from the macro perspective, in 2023, I think, or 2022, after the hash rate. I mean, obviously, immediately the hash rate plummeted, right? But it was only a little bit of time, I think a few weeks before it just started recovering again, right? And I think that speaks to just how Bitcoin, when I give talks about this, I always mention how China, to me, is like the red team in a sense. And to be fair, they haven't actually done, and in red team cybersecurity, it's just kind of the person who's trying to play around with the network, try to hack you, try to see your weaknesses. And I do think the Chinese authorities did try to do that. I don't think it was as deliberate as most Bitcoiners think. I don't think it was something where it was hey, we're trying to destroy Bitcoin. But I do think that, the provincial authorities that kind of obeyed the national authorities, it created a setup where, if anything, Bitcoin, this was one of Bitcoin's biggest tests, maybe the biggest, right? Because of how much, the equipment was built in China, how many physical miners were probably there as well. So the thing with that, though, is that China's Bitcoin mining ban didn't really work for a number of different reasons. The first, which is the most obvious, it's just that the way Bitcoin mining works, it's very geographically mobile. And so whoever, left, and a bunch of people left, we know of several miners who left different parts of China and publicly declared that they would move to Austin, Texas, or different places, right? And certainly what you saw was the emergence of Foundry. And Foundry at various points now is now the world's largest mining pool. by most, accounts, right? I think, what was interesting is before the ban or the moratoriums, I, wrote about how Ripple CEO was always butting about how like China controls Bitcoin. Like China's the one that, look at all these Chinese mining pools. They like control all the hash rate and, there's probably a lot of physical miners in China, right? And then you always have the reverse, and it's like China banned the whole thing, and then the system still survived, right? So I think it just speaks to like the fact that mining is distributed in different ways, and that different centralization points can become decentralized very rapidly. The first one that we saw with the ban was geographic, right? Now, I'm not sure. So the most accurate stats that we have are from the Cambridge Center for Alternative Finance. Unfortunately, they have stopped publishing the metrics, but the way they used to do it is they would actually ask the mining pools, different ways to get, the IP addresses of the miners, right? And for China, they always use some kind of proxy method, I think, in order to more truly estimate, Chinese kind of, hash rate, or Chinese miners that were physically located in China. And in 2022, I think they estimated that like 21% of, mining hash rate around the world was still in China. And so I've definitely heard, for example, that there are entire regions, Xinjiang, even though that their provincial governments put in that, there was a ban, they never really stopped mining is what I've heard. There was, Daniel Batten had a report where he had 3 or 4 kind of miners go off the record and say they were still mining in China. We have the Cambridge Center for Alternative Finance, that shows that, maybe there was about 21% of the hash rate still in China, even after the bans. So the reality is like, you can't really go after Bitcoin mining. First, it can escape your borders. And I think the Chinese party state regrets that somewhat. There was a Hong Kong professor that wrote an editorial, an op-ed that said like, look at what a catastrophic mistake this has been, because all of the miners who are providing local tax revenue, now they've gone to the United States, the greatest rival. If you had a problem with controlling it, just mine it with state-owned enterprises, right? And now China's economic crisis that we're facing is very specifically actually a crisis with local governments, because China's property values have gone down, and the way China's local governments fund themselves is not through the income tax, which is more through the national government, but through property. So it works a little bit similar. I don't know how it works in Europe, but it works kind of similar to the American or Canadian. Like, for example, like, most cities raise most of their revenue from, property taxes, right?
Yes. Yeah.
So local governments were the ones that benefited from Bitcoin mining. And we still seem to understand that there are still people doing this, even though the national government has stepped up and restricted it. And that's partially because the economic incentives are just too strong. If you have stranded power, or if you're a power company, you're not going to be able to create demand, as quickly as Bitcoin miners can flock to you, right? Yeah. And by design, like, people forget, but like, Bitcoin miners they're not like, they're looking for the lowest cost energy sources. And the fact that you have the lowest cost energy sources in China is a function of the fact that, China is a country that produces the most electricity in the world, but also has a very weird distribution because it's very top down built. So for example, in Sichuan province, where a lot of miners went, there were a lot of hydroelectricity dams that were built, right? You can think of the Three Gorges Dam and other remnants, but those are built to way over capacity, right? Like, you can't just like spawn cities over there. So there's tons of stranded power. So if you're a local government, the economic incentives are just so strong. I mean, you have a resource that you make $0 off of, that someone can come in and you can make, local governments, revenue and raising and things like that, right? Now, I think what's happened is that these are probably under the table deals. I've never gotten like an on the record confirmation of this, but probably private power companies or local governments are signing deals with some of these miners and saying like, you give us a little bit of a cut, whether it's directly to the local government official, probably more directly to the local government official, honestly, because they're already doing something that's legal, right? And then, you can operate and we won't disturb you. Like, cause we also manage the local police. So the local police won't come in and like burst in and stuff like that. So I think that speaks to the resilience of mining in the network in two ways. One is that the economic incentives are so strong. It's like it draws you towards the energy and the power. So it doesn't matter even if it's quote unquote illegal, like the incentives are still so strong, so profitable, even for the local governments that we're talking about, right? This is why countries, I think it's in China's advantage. I'm actually a pretty big fan of China not doing this, but I think it's in China's immense advantage to like, get Bitcoin because it's a much more acceptable form of currency. You mentioned BRICS and you see Russia resorting to doing this, but Russia's problem is like their currency is not accepted like pretty much anywhere now. Like they have difficulty selling their energy for like anything. Like they've signed deals with Pakistan for Pakistan to send them like fruit or something for oil. That's how bad it's become because they're so sanctioned, right? Yeah. So, but the general point I'm trying to make is that China is actually in the position to have the most surplus of electricity. Most of it is stranded, right? I had this conversation with someone about private power markets, and basically Bitcoin mining was subsidizing power markets for, different cities. Like after the Bitcoin mining ban, what happened was when the miners left, there were some markets, some power markets in China that actually went, the cost suddenly went up. And people are like, well, how are you charging me for this? Well, it's because we used to have a demand factor that no longer exists for that power. So now we have to charge you extra for the transmission and all this other stuff. The Bitcoin mining is resilient because the numbers make sense even if it's illegal. And even if it's quote unquote illegal, like how are you going to enforce that? You had some provinces like Inner Mongolia had like a phone line, and it was basically like you can snitch on your neighbors if you think they're Bitcoin mining. But like again, and that was one of the reasons why some of the miners left. It's just one of those things that's like so hard to enforce. And China hasn't systematically tried to do this. I do think if they could do something similar, maybe to like what Venezuela has done, or like I've heard reports that Venezuela, like the army and the police will actually like have access to local power grid information and they will go after that. That hasn't really quite been the case in China. Again, because I think it's something the national government has done kind of as like it was kind of like an afterthought, in one of their standing committees. And then the local governments had to act somehow. And a lot of them put laws on the books, but some of them are still, I think, quietly working with miners anyways. Yeah. And they're the ones with like the police and everything, right? So it's like, but even if the national government wanted to like physically ban every physical miner from working in the system, I don't even think they could do that. And they can do nothing to stop, people leaving and mining elsewhere, which has been also the case as well. Like a lot of the physical hash rate that we can see has probably left China.
Yeah. Yeah. I think it's really interesting when I think two points, like if you are actively banning Bitcoin in general as a country, how strong is your own currency, right? Like it's basically an admission of failing at keeping your own currency strong, if something that is so unrelevant and such a Ponzi scheme, etc., right, is a threat to you that you would allocate resources to, ban or control it, or however, you want to describe it. So I think that is interesting in general, but also, with BRICS and also, let's say, BRICS block members wanting to trade with other countries. For me, the whole point of Bitcoin is that you can trade with whoever you want, and the entire point is you don't have to trust them, right? Yeah. Because I think the prime example of the US having the world reserve currency is that, okay, if I'm forced to sell my oil and get dollars, that looks like a okay trade, but I cannot trust that the US won't debase their currency, and so that the dollars that I get for my oil eventually lose value, right? So for me, that's a very big nation state use case for Bitcoin, is the fact that you can do this global trade and instant settlement, and you can also do that with countries that you don't necessarily like, or at least of which the currency you don't like or don't want to have, right? So I feel that with this urge also of putting the BRICS together, and you see that they are bigger than G7, even G10 maybe, in GDP, right? That they have this issue of figuring out what could be a currency to settle even between us if we just trade with each other. So yeah, I think it's interesting that also the person that you mentioned said like, yeah, well, maybe this was a mistake. Maybe we fumbled the bag. It sounds so logical, and I always, when I look at myself, I think like it cannot be that I have better strategic insight as to why a nation state should adopt Bitcoin. Like I would assume there's people inside of a government that would see the same thing, right? So that's always kind of how I check that thought.
Quick question. If you have your Bitcoin in self-custody, where are you keeping your Bitcoin seed words? For me, there's only one way, and that's backing up my seed phrase with stamp seed. It's a single durable plate without any parts or materials. Stamp your words into solid titanium, which is fire-resistant, water-resistant, and built to last. Unlike etching or engraving, stamp seed's patented tools help you to deeply stamp every letter for permanent readability, making it easy for you to protect your generational wealth. Don't risk losing your seed phrase on paper. Get a stamp seed plate for unmatched protection. You can use code BRAM, that's BRAM, for 15% off at stampseed.com.
Well, no, it's a really interesting sort of thought, and trust me, I have a lot of thoughts on BRICS. But let me first start talking a little bit about China. What's really interesting about China is that China, the country, has, and this is where it's like, the China, the country, China, the government, China, the people, China, the parts of the government, right? So I think what's happened with China is that the technocrats have recognized very early on, they were definitely the earliest central bankers and regulators to recognize how much of a threat Bitcoin would be. And part of the reason why is because China has the strictest capital controls in the world. It's gotten a little bit less in the last few years, but still, like during that time period we're talking about, China, like statistically was measured. There's like a study I cited that has the most extreme capital controls. And specifically the thing that most people probably, that's like the headline item, is that Chinese people need approval in order to take more than 50,000 USD a person a year out of the country, to buy 50,000 USDs worth of foreign currency outside. What they've always feared, but the Chinese Communist Party has always feared, and the technocrats especially have always feared, is that people, kind of like to your point, they would move their currency outside and weaken the currency. This has happened several times. Whenever China's had economic confidence issues, for example, 2015, 2016, there was kind of this issue of the stock markets had a little bit of a meltdown, and there were many failings of different companies. I mean, one thing that people don't seem to appreciate is that, like, I think China's economy has gotten so bad recently. I'm not someone who will predict that the CCP will fail at any given time, and I can go in with you about this, but this does feel a little bit different. A lot of companies are failing or laying off people, and that is affecting people's lives. I was just reading about how there's, this is a very Chinese tendency, but there's a lot of like companies that sell like 30-year memberships or like 7-year memberships or something. Really? And then now they're going bankrupt. Yeah. There's like gyms or yoga studios that like, we'll sell you like a 30-year membership, but those are going bankrupt now. It's very Chinese because Chinese developers are the same thing. They're like, we'll sell you like a pre-developed house, and you just have to put down a deposit.
Pay it up front? Or?
You pay it up front. Yeah. It's like very, I don't know. It's like a very, I can't even really describe it. But the point is that the Chinese economy is doing really badly in ways that are like very obvious now, in ways that, like, for example, in 2015, 2016 were also as obvious, like headline GDP growth, but also people aren't getting jobs. People are seeing their friends getting laid off. Companies that they've bought like these 7-year or 30-year packs from are like failing. But most importantly, real estate developers that promise units like pre-starts, right? They take your deposit and then they finish it. They don't like finish. Well, they finish the unit to the point where it's like you can live in it, right? And then you go in and live in it, right? But they are not actually delivering some of those units. That's like the most existential crisis right now. You have people who paid a deposit and they're not being made whole. So all these examples, in the Chinese scene, they want to control people leaving the system, because if too many people leave at once, what's called capital flight, then the Chinese yuan will depreciate and it will weaken significantly. And that is something they don't. So China plays this balance where like they still want the yuan. It's less about like whether the yuan is weak or not. Although Xi Jinping has professed his own support for like a strong yuan for like sentimental reasons or like emotional reasons, it's more that they are terrified of anything that will restrict their control. If it makes sense, it's like more the volatility and less where it kind of goes. Because right now, currently, if China's yuan goes down, it does have the benefit of helping Chinese exports be more competitive.
Yeah.
And if Trump does impose tariffs and things like that, then you can obviously see that, you know, that actually might make sense for them to do.
But
right?
more about keeping the doors closed, basically.
Yeah, it's more about keeping it so that the government is the one that is kind of like managing how much the yuan is going versus the US dollar. That's like the most important relationship they have. Yeah. And if other people can get out, and that's the thing with Bitcoin, right? That is one way. I've always told people like Bitcoin is one way for people to step out of the system, not in a like, let's make a revolution way, in a, this is the numbers that make sense way. So that's kind of like with China. And that's the thing. The technocrats realize that the Bitcoin was such a threat to that. And that's what they've been trying to restrict more than anything else. But unlike other countries, now the US is actually the reverse. The US, the elected politicians are now saying we have strong opinions about Bitcoin. Trump, Lummis, the senators. And so any decision that you make, for example, if the Fed were to embrace a central bank digital currency, a digital dollar, at least in the form as currently proposed, they have to defer to the elected officials. So now it's kind of like a very different stance, if that makes sense. In China, the technocrats were able to move quick. And so that's why China seems to have responded really quickly. But one thing I always bring up is if someone does orange pill Xi Jinping, way above my grade rate again, but that can all change in a little bit of an instant.
Yeah. So this, I think you touched upon it, but you know, this historical relationship with currency control obviously influences their approach to Bitcoin. But then how do you see this tension that arises with all their efforts with BRICS? Because and maybe you agree or not, but I think, again, you know, South Africa is not going to trade in yuan with another BRICS member. So, you know, they will need some sort of trustless currency in that sense. And I mean, in Russia, there have been reports that they are mining, that they hold it, etc. You see also policy legal wise, you see definitions change and the acceptance. Yeah. So what is your view on that? Because they, you know, if, and also what you said about the states, if they would actually adopt a Bitcoin strategic reserve, it seems like China cannot stay behind in that sense, even if they don't necessarily want it or understand it. Like it's what Safety Namus talks about, right? Like it's financial gunpowder. So yeah, it's kind of like if your adversaries go, you have to go as well, even if you don't really like it or don't really understand it yet.
Yeah, I mean, I certainly think China, like for example, like the local governments are doing that in practice already, right? Like they're already saying like it just makes sense to mine Bitcoin. They're just doing it kind of under the table, probably, right? I think for the national government to have a change of heart is kind of a different matter, but at least we see some of that already, right? Like we see some of that, like the States is doing this. So why are we not also taking advantage? And China does have, I mean, it's funny. I always talk about this with people. Like I know we languaged it as like the strategic Bitcoin reserve, but let's actually break that down. The strategic Bitcoin reserve for the United States currently as it stands is a bunch of funds seized from Bitfinex, which you can argue, belongs to the original. Yeah. And then the rest is from like someone stole like a bunch of Bitcoin from Ross, right? So like when we talk about the Bitcoin strategic reserve, I know currently as it stands, right? Like that's kind of, and so people have also mentioned that China has a strategic business Bitcoin reserve in that sense, and it does. China did seize a bunch of Bitcoin from different places, most notably, you know, with the Plus token. So they seized like 210,000 Bitcoin or something like that at the time. And according to like some sources, they have still maintained like 15 or 20K Bitcoin extent from that. I mean, in terms of, I don't love talking about it, but like if you're talking about the strategic reserves, the first thing we have to acknowledge. Also, fun fact about that is the United Kingdom. Everybody talks about the 61,000 Bitcoin they hold. That's actually from Chinese people. And the Ministry of the Ministry of Foreign Affairs is actually like kind of involved with like the UK, because I know that's like been a back and forth. The United Kingdom, some people have petitioned Rachel Reeves, who's the current chancellor, to sell that Bitcoin. But that case is actually from a takeaway worker who took that Bitcoin from her boss, quote unquote, in China, and 61,000 Bitcoin that the Metropolitan Police seized from her. But in reality, it's originally from funds that Chinese people held. So it's just interesting, just the state of play for the strategic Bitcoin reserve, kind of when you think about it that way. I do think so. China actually moved its ETH that it seized from that same seizure that we're talking about, and I think that they're trying to sell the ETH right now. I think that they're probably not going to sell the amount of Bitcoin that they hold. I do think it would surprise me a lot if they were selling Bitcoin. And I will say this: China is better at selling Bitcoin than Germany is, for example. So China has been quietly kind of like holding seized Bitcoin, and it kind of uses over-the-counter trading. There's this company called Beijing Zifen. It's like chain dig. It's kind of like this like chain analysis equivalent, but it also helps work with like over-the-counter trading desks. And so the Chinese government has been stealthily, from the tracking and the reporting I can see, holding seized amounts and disposing of them. Sometimes not so quietly. You can see it in the court cases. Like the courts will say like they've seized this to this amount. We know of the large seizure that I mentioned to you. So China already has kind of like some amount that are in state hands. Whether it chooses to sell or not, I don't think it's going to sell. It may acquire more just the same way other states have kind of acquired, which is kind of like seizures, right? Now, if Trump actually follows through and buys Bitcoin separately from that, right? If there's like national mining, those are two kind of different things. I think China, the national government, can and should think about two things. Like one is to think about actively buying Bitcoin apart from seizures that just happen like out of luck, right? And two is to mine it itself. But I'm of two minds of this. Like the number go upside, of course, that would be great. But whether or not it would be good for the network or not, I mean, you could say that China, like any other country, is following incentives, but it does involve the state getting more involved. And lest we forget, a lot of the centralization choke points are actually Chinese-based companies. For example, Bitmain and Bitdeer and MicroBT are all still Chinese incorporated. They may not make their manufacturing in China anymore. That's one thing to think about. But they have like pre-established relationships with like mining pools. So already, I mean, this is like a very, the mining block templates and things like that. People talk about that all the time as a centralization choke point. So if you had the state, the national government actually get involved in Bitcoin, first, it would mean two things. One, it would mean that China cares a lot more about Bitcoin than it currently has. And by China, I mean the national government. I mean like Xi Jinping and his closest economic advisors. Two, it would mean that they might pull levers that they haven't pulled before. I think that they haven't really done that before.
They really see the light, you mean, of the strategic importance.
Yeah. So, I mean, it would be good for the network from a monetary standpoint, but it might not be good for the network in terms of decentralization, in terms of self-sovereignty and the properties that we would want to see. So that's one thing I always bring up.
Yeah.
In terms of BRICS, just to tie that together to BRICS, because I know you've asked me, BRICS is a very odd, it's not that I agree or disagree with you. It's that I find BRICS to be a very odd political construct in the first place in terms of geopolitics. Yeah. Because for example, India and China are mortal enemies. And they have engaged in skirmishes, and there have been like border fights before.
Those are crazy videos, by the way.
Yeah. Well, it's kind of crazy because both of them, this is actually kind of funny.
Sticks and stuff, right?
Well, because they're not allowed to use guns because they don't want to escalate. So there's like, I don't know if that actually makes sense, but like, they're
fighting anyway, right? Yeah,
they're fighting anyway.
They're fighting with sticks and stuff.
Yeah, and some people are getting killed or wounded. I guess the whole point is like for there not to be like a very obvious reason to escalate.
Yeah.
But I mean, it is kind of nuts. If any of your viewers want to see it, it's like a bunch of Chinese people, like they're throwing like slingshots of rocks.
Yeah. in like a
bunch
crazy environment too, right? Like it's somewhere in the mountains or something.
It's
really
in the
wild.
mountains because because that border of India and China is by the, it's like basically by the Himalayas.
Yeah.
So it's all by the mountains. But so anyways, it's kind of an odd construct, but I will say a couple of things. One is that I think China is trying to use the CBDC bridge, to work with certain members. So not necessarily the core members of BRICS, but they have this project called Project M Bridge, which is kind of like an inter CBDC bridge. And they have signed deals with like Saudi Arabia and the United Arab Emirates. And I believe both the UAE and Saudi Arabia are now part of,
it's like
part
a
of
settlement layer.
Yeah.
Right?
And they have purchased oil directly in ECNY. So it seems like, I mean, for China has like kind of like China's the world's largest commodities importer. You know, it's a huge food importer. I believe number one, but I have to fact check that. But just from population alone, I would guess it's the number one food importer as well. And then it also imports, large amounts of its, like at least oil and gas. It still does. And so, if it has willing partners, like it really cares about those. So it has willing partners in Saudi Arabia and the United Arab Emirates. Now, with the Trump administration in power, one of the things that might be underlooked is that the Biden administration was not able to rein in Saudi Arabia. They certainly were not able to really get the Middle East almost kind of like went closer to China during this time. To give you a quick example, not only did they sell oil in ECNY, which is a direct attack against the petrodollar, but Saudi Arabia and the United Arab Emirates also there's companies like G42 that help them with like semiconductor pass through with like Chinese companies. China has gone closer economically with Saudi Arabia and the United Arab Emirates while the Biden administration has been around. That's because there's a lot of tension, right? Some of it I think is legitimate. For example, like I'm not anyone's, way above my pay grade, but for example, like Saudi Arabia did kill Jamal Khashoggi for what we know and stuff like that. So the Biden administration tends to remind the Saudis of that. The Trump administration tends to be like, we don't really care. And like, we love you, Abraham Accords, etc. So I do think that will maybe pair Saudi Arabia and everything back. And there was something interesting that happened, which is
with
normally when China,
did you see that? Did you see the bonds, the dollar bonds that China issued in Saudi Arabia like last week? Did you see that?
Exactly. There's going to be a little bit of a rapprochement from that respect. So that's just going to be like political reality that like the Middle East is probably going to get clustered in. BRICS itself is like a very weird construct. I think Brazil, has an election coming up in 2026. What I've said is like probably the thing that would get China's attention is if all of a sudden, and most likely to happen right now, because Saudi Arabia and the UAE and all these powers, they are still, they're trying to portray themselves as a crypto hub. Like I know that there's OTC desks that are like trying to go up there and things like that. But I don't think the governments are very seriously considering being Bitcoin friendly, if that makes sense. Right? Like, I don't know to what extent they will participate in this. They are energy powers. So likely they're going to start by mining if they do. But they've also shown that they're willing to accept CBDCs and be willing to be part of a CBDC package. To me, this indicates like a mercenary attitude. The whole idea is like,
like whatever's most opportunistic or something.
Yeah. Whatever pays us the bills, whatever pays the bills, like whoever wants to pay for our stuff, we'll just like accept it in different formats. We've accepted the ECNY. We've accepted the US dollar.
Well, they basically have free energy. I mean,
yeah, exactly. I mean, I think it makes a lot of sense. I think what you'll see with the Middle East is like, hopefully they'll publicly announce that they're mining Bitcoin and then they're kind of more on the train. But I think what's more likely to happen is you're going to see governments that are aligned, more like elected governments. And the one thing that, people are kind of underlooking is the Cairns group. So the Cairns group is kind of like the major agricultural exporters. And many of them, if you assume a United States that's friendly, right? Then there's Argentina with Malay. That's going to have very good relationships with Trump, with the president. Then you have like Brazil will maybe change government in 2026. And then Australia and Canada have elections in 2025. I can't speak to Australia, But in Canada, currently we have a left-wing government that's probably going to get replaced. And that's going to be a lot more Bitcoin friendly. A lot of the agricultural exporters, China keeps a very close eye on because it's very dependent. And if all of these countries start saying, not only are we mining Bitcoin, because mining Bitcoin is just kind of a like whether or not you're an energy surplus. It's an endorsement of Bitcoin, but it's almost kind of like more, it's a weak endorsement, if that makes sense. It's like you have the stranded energy anyways. Mm-hmm. And Bitcoin is the best use of that energy for those stranded resources. But it's kind of a weak kind of thing. Versus the United States, if it actively buys Bitcoin, it's saying that we actively value it more than zero, if that makes sense. Or more than the opportunity cost of energy. And so if all these countries have which is a very different thing than them mining, in competition with each other, at least I think, then you will see, China, I think, really pay attention from a geopolitical standpoint. But the other thing that people miss, and I think that is the most underrated part of Trump's transition, is how much power Tether will have in this administration and how much power stablecoins will have. And so I think the fight now is between three paths. I think you will have, China is going to try to advance its central bank digital currency. It's been trying to do this with the Bank of International Settlements, which is kind of the central bank for central banks. But recently, the Bank of International Settlements actually abandoned the Project ENDORSE project and said, this is China's project alone. And I think that's partially because it recognizes that the West is firmly turning against central bank digital currencies. So, with what Trump is saying, with the Republican platform and things like that, right? I think other governments in the Western bloc, like Canada, you've also seen Canada has canceled the digital Canadian dollar as well, are going to have the same thing. But they're going to so China is going to try to do the CBDC path. And what's interesting about that is that even though we just talked about India and China being mortal enemies, the fact that India's technocrats have adopted a central bank digital currency, the digital rupee, and is trying to restrict cryptocurrencies shows that even if the elected officials are head to head against each other, that it makes sense for central bankers. So the fight is really more against the technocrats, against elected officials, if that makes sense. In countries where the technocrats are running ahead with this policy, where someone like Modi is trying to demonetize the system anyways, his instincts are towards currency control and towards listening to his technocrats. You see those countries start embracing central bank digital currencies, even if they might be ideologically very different. It's just from a central banker's perspective, that's kind of like where they want to go, right? No matter what kind of central banker you are, you kind of want to go in that direction. So that Bank of International Settlements, I think you're going to see CBDC bridges between countries like this. Like Nigeria has been trying, India has been trying. That shouldn't be underrated. In the West, I think you're going to have potentially CBDCs, but by another name. So it might be stablecoins. It might be the Treasury issuing CBDCs of a kind. It might be like CBDCs that are wholesale within the banking system. But one thing that is very underrated in the geopolitical tensions is Tether. Tether will have unprecedented power. Howard Lutnick, who is, Cantor Fitzgerald's, I believe, co-CEO or CEO, outright CEO or whatever, senior member of Cantor Fitzgerald. They are the custodian for Tether's treasuries. And Tether is buying a ton of treasuries. And one thing that I should be remiss without mentioning is that a lot of Chinese people buy Bitcoin, but a lot more Chinese people buy Tether. And I think the Chinese people buying Tether is more annoying to the Chinese government than Bitcoin itself, actually, because it's the Chinese government's trying to reduce its dependency on the US dollar and US Treasury reserves, but its people are defying it to buy US Treasuries indirectly through Tether. They're demonstrating that they would rather save in USDT or in Bitcoin rather than in the yuan or in the assets returned in the yuan. So there's that path. And then there's going to be a path of I think among the BRICS countries, I think this will be the coolest, is if you have cypherpunk countries. And I honestly believe that that's only going to come about when the new generation comes to power, when you get real Bitcoin native people. Because forget, even now today with President Trump saying whatever, he's going to say crypto, he's raised with World Liberty Financial. If you ask him the difference between, this or that, we don't expect, the president to know this or that, but he just doesn't, he won't know. But if you start having people I think, I interviewed her before, Maya, and, you know, whether or not she wins or not, or whether or not, whatever, but her generation of politicians like that, who are actually Bitcoin natives, understand like self-sovereignty, understand like the privacy aspects, understand that. I think hopefully there will be some countries. I think Bukele could kind of be like that, but he's still part of the older generation politicians that's trying to understand this. Versus if you have people that are, and you see that a little bit already. I wrote about it for Forbes, but for example, you had, someone in the French Bitcoin community that ran for the French legislative elections. You're going to have more people who are part of the Bitcoin community, I think, and some people who have, you know, adopted as well. So anyways, to sum that all up, BRICS is kind of a weird construct. I think there's going to be three paths: CBDC, stablecoin to CBDC, or Cypherpunk countries. But I think at the end of the day, all of us are going to have to rely on ourselves, to make sure that we get the self-sovereignty that Bitcoin promises.
Well, I mean, I don't think Polyev is a diehard Bitcoiner, but he gets Bitcoin, right, in Canada, and I think how he talks about money printing and the debasement and inflation, etc. It seems like he gets it. I love what you just said about this next generation, and I'm in touch with Maya regularly, and I hope she wins. That would be, I think, a really great example that she could set. I also saw in the past 2 weeks there is, I think, a vice presidential or presidential candidate in Poland who proposed something.
Yeah,
with a young guy.
Poland's Libertarian Party. I believe the Dutch Libertarian Party, some of the members have also shown up as well to Bitcoin Amsterdam.
Yeah. So, I mean, I mean, this is just as with any new technology that's emergent. It just takes time for the old guard to leave and the new guard to come around. But yeah, I just think it's, when you mentioned Maya, I had to think, if you really adopt Bitcoin, it's such an advertisement for your government, for your reign over the country, right? Like the fact that you adopt like a non-sovereign, transparent, immutable money actually says something about how you value your citizens and the time and energy of the citizens, and how you will restrict yourself as a government from creating a deficit or an even bigger deficit, right? So I feel like it's a two-way street, but I also understand it takes a certain understanding to get there, and that understanding will take some time. And I think up until then, it's just going to be people moving along or you know, trying to keep a certain system alive, whether consciously or not, doesn't really matter, you know, but something is in place and that is what we use, etc. And so there's not really that opening yet, but perhaps someone like Maya can, you know, break that glass ceiling in a sense and show how you can do it differently, right? It's
Well, one thing I would also be remiss to add is, because I think Maya, at least from the conversations I've had with her, right, like she seems to be a cypherpunk, right? Versus like, you know, some of the politicians of before, they're kind of in between. Like you mentioned Pierre Poilievre, and I've heard different things, and I know he's definitely more Bitcoin friendly, understands the inflation part for sure, but I wouldn't say he's a cypherpunk. Right. I do think what's really cool, we spent a lot of this conversation talking about the Chinese government. And I do want to just point out one thing I'd be remiss without pointing out, which is one of the coolest things I've seen is Chinese people getting cypherpunk pill. Like not just the government, right? Like the government, how the government will act or not act. I think that will, in China, it's a little bit different because obviously like the party controls everything kind of thing. So it's not as clean of a link of like, you know, the culture feeds into the politics. So for example, someone like Maya is someone who like learned, in terms of the politics, not in terms of the technology, and then now is influencing the politics, right? In China, that's not, or the cycle will be longer because of just the way Chinese politics works, right? I don't think you'll have some of the quote unquote Bitcoin friendly people that were in the Chinese Communist Party are in life imprisonment now.
The shortcut is probably a Bitcoiner becoming a president or a leading figure in a government.
Right. But I will say that the seeds, and these are like, and it's not like a lot of people, I don't want to exaggerate it, but like, you know, I always point to in the book, I think I was one of the first people to write about like MPubs and like Nostr, because there were Chinese people using Nostr, not in like, a lot of them are just having fun, but it was so cool to see that people were like talking about, when you see the world's most advanced surveillance state, they're talking to each other about like, here's like a relay that can be used without VPN. Here's how, here's the difference between it being on the App Store on an APK, this like level of education. And I think that is ultimately, I'm hopeful, more of a guarantor of people's understanding of Bitcoin and the need for Bitcoin and technologies, Nostr and Freedom Tech overall, than anything the government necessarily does or does not do. Because the Chinese government, if you ask me 10 or 20 years from now what it's going to be like or whatever, it's very hard to predict because it's very unilateral. One person makes one decision and that can move it all the way over, right? But what I can see and predict is that Chinese people are embracing Bitcoin for practical solutions for problems that they have that the government has caused for them. But also that some Chinese people are not just, using it as a solution, but are learning the culture and are learning why it's so important to be self-sovereign, right? It's very intuitive for, I think, Chinese people to understand because they have been under so many different layers of repression, whether that's like you can't exit your money or whether that's like if you go to this website, we don't allow you to go to this website, right? So it's like very in your face. In the West, this exists too, but China is more in your face about it.
Yeah.
And so, for example, it's in the States, you might have social media, but it's kind of like soft moderated in certain ways, right? Like, the previous administration might have talked to like Twitter and Facebook and been like, you have to remove these, blah, 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 right? But in China, they just literally tell you can't be on Facebook or you can't be on Twitter. So it's very obvious to a Chinese person to be like, I just don't have access to this, right?
Yeah.
So it's like, you can see the cage. In the West, I think sometimes you can't, the cages are different, by the way. I'm not saying it's the same, but you almost can't see the cage. But in China, you can see the cage so cleanly in front of you. And so, understanding, I think that like understanding of like, I need to get money out of the system. I need to like use a VPN or I need to do this kind of it's almost like more innate because of the circumstances. And so seeing them understand that and still start building a culture of their own, a cypherpunk culture, sometimes in some corners is really interesting.
So how do you then, maybe that's more towards the future, but how do you see the balance of power shifting then if, between this state-driven technology and open source money like Bitcoin or open source communication like Nostr, how do you see that evolve? Is that, maybe it's the same as what I usually say about Bitcoin, it's kind of like this mind virus, just one by one, people see that there's this different paradigm that they can adopt. I mean, I don't know if Nostr, in a sense, is able to be tracked on the phones in China, or how they would do that. I don't know how that technically works, but yeah.
Yeah, what can work for that is like you can use like desktop clients, right? Because so the reason why some Chinese people use Nostr is because explicitly it's just a private key, public key that you can generate on like desktop devices or mobile, right? So it doesn't require you to yeah. So anyways.
So how do you kind of like see that evolve towards the future? This tension between there is this open source software for money and for communication versus the cage that you just described.
Yeah, it's funny. This is actually what the book is about. A lot of people ask me, is it China? Is it history? Is it Bitcoin? And, after wrestling with this for a long, long time, that is actually what the thesis boils down to. Towards the latter half of the book, the last few chapters, it's literally all about this, whether or not there's a state-driven development model or open source that will win out. And I think, the problem with the open source technology stack is some of it, we talk about Bitcoin often and it's money without the state. And I think that's so powerful in ways that we just can't understand or have fathom. I also think that the infrastructure for what that truly means hasn't been fully expressed yet. If you know about the liberty in our lifetimes and things like that, there's just some of the things that exist, that haven't fully potentiated yet, because we live in the context we live in. So Bitcoin is an example to me. It's money without the state, but everybody lives in a state. So we haven't seen Bitcoin's full potential yet. Just one thing that I think about. But explicitly, if we were to compare the two, both China and the US are kind of competing with one another on the internet stack. And China's way of doing it is to kind of like ring fence itself from the American internet. And it's trying to tell other countries, like, yeah, the way to do it is you develop your own kind of sovereign tech stack that are companies based in your jurisdiction. Because at the end of the day, if you have the companies that control the protocols, platforms, not protocols, then you can mediate through government control. And the better thing is for those companies to be very strongly under your own country's control. So that's been the fight with the state-driven model. In the United States, there's this kind of like the states controls a lot of default internet infrastructure. The DNS system, ICANN, a lot of this used to be under complete American control. It's kind of like decentralized a little bit. But the point is that the United States has a lot of its power because it controls the companies that essentially control the protocols for most people. The best example I can give up is email. And my hope is that Bitcoin, and I think Jameson Lopez expressed something like this, my hope is that Bitcoin doesn't become like email now. Because email now, it's like in order for you to use it, yes, sure, it's a decentralized protocol and you can technically use it, whatever, but the clients are under the control of the world's largest companies, which are under the control of different countries.
Yeah.
China wasn't particularly innovative about it. What they're trying to sell to other countries with varying success, right? To an Iran or to a Nigeria or to other places is a cyber sovereignty. It's to say split off from the American rails and build your own domestic rails. And I think this argument is more convincing for other countries than most Americans will realize. For example, in Europe, I believe this is like a huge debate now. So the problem is like being like, Europeans have tried to use the market, the common market to enforce this actions upon American companies. But China, what it did was it just decided to build its own companies. So Baidu, ByteDance, and now some of those companies are competitive even in the quote unquote West, which annoys the hell out of the United States because they're like, this is our playbook. How did you do this? Right. So now we need to ban TikTok and all those other things, and it needs to be acquired by an American company. This is exactly the crux of the state-driven model. So this is a state-driven model fighting itself. Where I say the open source model, the advantage is that open source has quite a few dramatic advantages. One is global reach and distribution. People will simply just refuse to be in these silos we mentioned. So in the Chinese internet and the American internet, the incentives are large. Don't get me wrong. Like you can be a Google engineer, you can be a Baidu engineer, you get paid a ton of money, get paid a ton of stock options. That is a way to live a comfortable life. But you'll never get access to the complete global talent pool. And you'll never get access to the people who are trying to build in order to advance this like positive vision, right? There's almost no, and I mean, Bitcoin core developers prove this every day because they could be taking a job that pays them way more every single day, right? Like there is no way to like kind of run through this. Now countries pay lip service to open source because of this, because they want the most amount of talent, the smartest people thinking about the biggest problems. But I think open source is where those people gather. And I think that's always been the case. If I think about like a Hal Finney or, someone who's kind of creating these platforms or using a non-Bitcoin example, Guido van Rossum, who created Python, right? Like these are the ways, or Linus, with Linux, like the open source model is a great way to aggregate the smartest people working together collaboratively. Think about the digital yuan and the central bank digital currency. Why I think the central bank digital currency will fail is because one reason is because it's not going to be as battle tested. It's not an open standard. But second, they just don't have access to like the talent and people, and the discourse. And the other thing about Bitcoin is like, I know it's annoying when you're in it. People are like, OPCTV, OPCAT, like we're fighting soft forks and stuff like that. But, that is like I do think at the end of the day, when you aggregate enough decision makers that have skin in the game, right? And you put them all together the way Bitcoin has. This is what we call the game theory. That's a superior way of making decisions rather than, for example, in the United States or China, very directly, there's some Chinese central banker way out of his depth, maybe talking to someone at WeChat Pay and Alipay and being like, what's the best system? Give me your technical vendor. Right. And so to me, this is why I think open source will win out. Now, I think the issue really is more that these closed state silos, they'll still exist. And they're supplemented by all the different things that a state has. Right. And so, for example, like, you can get a comfortable salary, you can get comfortable real estate, you can live a really comfortable life. And there are a lot of people who are going to think that way and work for the state fiat mines, right? Like that will exist for a very long time. So that's why I always mention that I think Bitcoin has shown a lot of potential, but I don't think we've seen nearly enough what Bitcoin and other freedom tech allows us to do, because we live in a world with so many of these assumptions and givens, and there's just these powerful states that we're born into. And the question I would ask some people is like, yeah, money without the state, but what about life without the state, right? Can we even imagine that? Can we even think through that? And what that means for open source development? I think the critical question of the 21st century is going to be, can you bring economic prosperity, energy prosperity to people without there needing to be a coordinating entity, without there needing to be guns and armies? And I think Bitcoin is a large part of that answer, but I don't think we've seen the full answer yet because we haven't seen what it's like to coordinate that. But Bitcoin plays a huge role because it does churn energy into money. And I think in that respect, without any coordinator, and I think in that respect, it shows a way, it shows a path. Whether or not we take that path is still an active debate in Bitcoin circles. Yeah. And it's the difference between people who, I have a lot of respect for people who have this opinion, but like, it's a difference between people who wish for the ETFs and the reserves and number go up and those who want it to be self-sovereign and liberty and free in a real sense in our lifetimes. So anyways, just want to
No, I love
that thing.
Thanks for sharing. Well, maybe this next question ties into that a bit. I want to ask you two more questions. What is a spiky point of view you have on Bitcoin that not many people share with you?
How about this? I think Bitcoin strategic reserves are actually really bad for the Cypherpunk self-sovereign adoption of Bitcoin. I actually think like, for example, when we talked about like, should China mine? And that's kind of like how I gave you the answer in two ways. Like the NGU side would it be like fantastic. I think this is something that I can almost certify that like 99% of Bitcoiners disagree with me on, probably just based off the way it's written about and stuff like that and like where everybody is. Unquestionably, the thing that most people care about is the price. I can't get away from that. I don't care about the price at all. My point being like, for me, I'm probably like on the extreme end of that. I'm very like, when I wrote this book, When Mao Hold Bitcoin, it has the history of the price and it has all these other things, but when I pitched it to a publisher, I think it was Wiley was like, got back to me and was like, does this book help at all understand how I can get rich through Bitcoin? And I'm like, no, it actually, no, like you'll learn more about different trends, but it's entirely not the point of this book. And then they said like, yeah, you're not going to publish with us. Yeah. So if I were to sum all that blah, blah, blah up, I would say the thing I care about most, that the spicy take I would have, Bitcoin is right, no matter the price. Right. And it doesn't matter if it's 10 cents or like $100,000. I still think it's as right as it was at the 10 cent mark as it was at the 100,000. I expect most Bitcoiners will disagree with me on that.
I think it's a very interesting point of view. I think I agree with you, to be honest, or let's say I don't disagree, but I think there's just different ways, there's different paths to like get there. Like, I think you are right in what you just said, but I'm not sure if enough people understand it yet, right? So it's kind of like, you can illustrate or paint a picture of how it can help people, where we can go. And that might be right or true. But yeah, if not enough people see that right now, then you're not right. You know what I mean? So I think that's just interesting that there's just so many different ways how we could get to that point. So I think it's a really interesting point of view, because that, and then in general, I don't think there's a lot of like right or wrong about where we can go. It's more about which path do you prefer, or do you hate it that, finance bros figure this out? And I'm in the middle between that, where I think like, yeah, I would love to have more normal people, more plebs figuring it out before the finance bros figure it out. But yeah, I love to think of like a Trojan horse type aspect, right? Like the fact that the finance bros figured it out also gives validity to that what Bitcoin is, which I think eventually substantiates our story or reasoning as to, what you just said, where we can go and how it can help people. So I don't know. I just believe like there is a path for this. Like I think I know what Bitcoin is and where it could go. And it's just like the path is unfolding in a sense. And there is a way that we can like be very rigid about it. Like, okay, it should go like this, but eventually it's a very organic, individual mind virus.
I think I'm philosophically right, but practically wrong. And that's the same as being wrong.
That's what I mean. No, that's exactly what I mean. So yes, conceptually 100% agree, but practically, it's just, we cannot really be, go to every person that buys the ETF and be like, do you know what you're doing, sir? Like that. I don't know.
Yeah, I know.
Like that's also not attractive if you do it like that, right? So it's just, it's interesting. Yeah. I want to ask you my last question, which I ask everyone the same question, which is, what is a core belief that you will never let go?
A core belief I will never, that's a really interesting one. I was ready for this idea you would ask, but I was going to originally say it was that we can live without the state. But I actually have thought about that in the last 10 minutes. And like, I think that like there can be, I don't know if it's like as convicted as I could be. Cause I think back to my evolution and how I thought. I used to be like, might as well tell you and everybody on the show, but like a very conventional thinker in terms of economics. It totally changed my mind view in the last like 10 years, and partially thankfully to the individual effects of the Bitcoin mind virus. So who's to say I won't change again? But I think one thing I'm very convicted on, and I think I will lifelong be convicted on, is that we shouldn't use our intelligence or being ahead of someone to exploit people. And what I mean by that is like, as Bitcoiners, we have this awesome responsibility, I think, to like, many of us are still so early. I don't even know what generation, like people are saying like, oh, I'm 2017 or whatever. I consider myself part of the 2012. That's when I first, whatever. I started writing about Bitcoin. By the way, for everyone listening, I lost everything in a boating accident, et cetera. I don't have any amounts, but
that's unfortunate, man.
But I actually was also really poor as a student, so I couldn't have afforded enough for a boating accident anyways, time. To me, it's like, we're all still so early. Like even people who are like, oh, I'm getting it now. I still think like everybody's still so early.
I agree.
And I think that like for me, one conviction I have is like I think this is going to be a lifelong thing, because this is something that I've believed for a very, very long time, even though it's manifest in different ways. It's like to use that for good, to use that for, not to exploit people who are not there already, to always try to educate and to try to get people to learn the principles and everything like that, even if they might not be thinking or convinced right now. And even if we, as Bitcoiners, I say, like get frustrated by like, so many people are so fiat minded. Like, why can't they see what we can't see? Like to be giving and to almost be like, have a very accepting mindset of that like when you're a rebel, it can be hard to be graceful when you win, if that makes sense.
Yeah.
And I would like to think that I believe Bitcoin will win. Bitcoiners are going to be the new aristocrats. Like if you believe in Bitcoin, you're convicted into where it's going to go, like I am, and I think it's going to be the world reserve currency, then the implications of that are like massive for your own personal life. Like anybody who got in at any point, even now or even 10 years later, they're going to be like massively wealthy. So I think what's important is just to keep, your character and outlook on that, no matter what happens, like to remember what brought you into Bitcoin. And for me, it was the curiosity aspect. Yeah. And I hope to keep that and spread that no matter where Bitcoin is.
Love that, man. Curiosity for me is also number one. So I'm happy you shared that. And yeah, man, I want to thank you for this very interesting conversation. Thank you so much for your insights and your time. And I really enjoyed it. So thank you.
Thanks, Brad. Thanks for having me on anytime. I really appreciate you making the time.
I hope you enjoyed this episode. If you did, you can click here to find more just like it, and click here to find all Bitcoin for Millennials podcast episodes. Also, please like this video if you want to help shine a light on the message of Bitcoin, and subscribe to my channel to stay connected. I hope to see you for a next episode.